You talk a lot about the Chinese mining companies in the book, and we don't have to get into too much detail, but basically, it's a kind of like it's I mean it's like a slave operation in many ways, and it's this a lot of corruption, a lot of just adding insult to injury in terms of the way they treat their workers. And I want to be clear, we pin a lot of this on the Chinese mining companies because they're the buyers, but we are then, like you said, buying our electronics and phones from the Chinese. So they're on the front line, sure, but we're the end user, and you can't really blame a drug dealer for a drug issue because the end user has to take some responsibility too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they are the inevitable consequence of a chain, a value chain that says, I want maximum resources at minimum cost. Okay, and so the inevitable consequence of that is the most vulnerable people are going to be exploited. The most downtrodden people are going to be degraded, and their resources are going to be pillaged. Now, had the opening sentence been, we need this resource, let's do it in a way that adheres to the proclamations we make, that it's done with dignity and respect and all of this business, we would not be having this conversation. We would be having a completely different conversation about how uplifting and empowering the rechargeable economy has been for the people of the Congo, not how destructive and ruinous it has been. So everything is a consequence of an economic order that made a declaration, I want that at minimum cost, do what you must. And so, yeah, that's that. But that said, it's not like these Chinese companies were operating in some magnificent manner beforehand. You know, they don't maintain human rights standards. You just look at what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. You know, and when you're on the ground, there's just this animus. You can sense it. This animus that the Chinese have. I mean, I'm speaking generally because, and I've spoken to some of the people working at these companies, some of the middle management people, and there's just this racist undertone, not unlike the racist undertone that Europeans had when they first arrived in Africa. It's all the same, but it means that there's this callous disregard for the dignity of the people who are there, let alone preservation of their environment.
Are there any American companies operating there in Congo?
No, not one.
Not one. Wow.
The last time there was an American mining company operating in the Congo was 2006. And they had the biggest concession actually in the Congo. This is Freeport McMoran. And they sold it to a Chinese mining company called China Molybdenum for $2.5 billion at the dawn of the cobalt explosion.
That's weird.
Is an awkward choice. I actually spoke to one of the executives at Freeport who ran that concession called Tenke Fungurume for Freeport. And I said, why? What was the thinking here? Because surely you could see where things were going. And, you know, he said Freeport was, and I write about this in the book, Freeport was on the wrong side of some oil and gas bets, and they had to made a commitment to the market to have cut in half the company's debt load, and that meant selling assets. And this was one of the prized ones that they could get a nice price for. So they sold it to CMOC, China Molybdenum, and China Molybdenum is now one of the biggest cobalt producing mining companies in the world.
Oh, man. I mean, and this is a strategic mineral for obvious reasons. And it's just, that's a whole different show, is how we're just completely reliant on China for rare earth metals and other things like that. You mentioned the Uyghurs and the way they're treated by the CCP. That's episode 730. We did a whole show about the Uyghur genocide with a Uyghur attorney. Is there other significant industry in Congo? Because where there's mining, I mean, you already mentioned that the rivers are polluted. I would imagine you can't farm very well if people are digging your land up and dumping acid all over it.
You know, with each trip I took to the Congo, each time I went back, the people living there were being pushed further and further into the fringes because the mining concessions just kept growing and growing and growing. It's that supply-demand imbalance again. It just kept taking over more countryside, more land, and that was cutting down agricultural land. Entire lakes and rivers were disappearing. So people are pushed more and more to the fringe, and there's literally almost nothing else people can do there to survive other than dig and hope to get that dollar or two for that day, which is the difference between eating or not. So when agricultural land is destroyed or polluted, when entire villages are bulldozed and people are displaced and left to fend for themselves, you have this degrading cycle of vulnerability and poverty that leads entire families, including children, to just scrounge back onto the land they used to live on to try and get a sack or two of cobalt to earn those few dollars, because that's how they'll eat that day. And so they're living day to day just to survive. And that's the reality that's at the bottom of the rechargeable economy.
In your opinion, why isn't this problem solved? Would it be prohibitively expensive to do this in a way that isn't horrifying?
It would be a rounding error on the balance sheets of tech and EV companies.
Really?
To solve this. And it could be done relatively quickly and easily. I mean, some of the simple things that could be done in a week to eliminate more than half of the harm that's taking place is buy some PPE for these people. Boots, gloves, goggles, masks. It's a one-time cost. How much does a suit of PPE cost for a person? One time, not that much, right? That cuts down their daily toxic exposure to cobalt, that buildup of heavy metal that they're suffering. How about pay people a fixed, simple daily wage? Instead of earning $2 in the day, that is not enough to survive, pay people a day wage of $10, $15. Now they don't have to bring their children into the mine to dig, to try to earn another $2, because mom and dad are getting a decent wage that's enough for the family to eat, have clothes, and keep the kids in school. $10 a day, bankrupt Apple, or Tesla, or any of these companies, they wouldn't notice it. It's a de minimis sum to them to pay their Congolese employees who are digging their cobalt out of the ground a basic surviving day wage plus some PPE.
Does the day wage solve the problem? I mean, I'm not trying to pop a hole in this, but like people say, well, you can't just give people more money because then you'll have inflation, which you'll end up with the same problem.
No, that day wage is what helps keep children in school. And that solves a lot of the child labor problem. And people think, they're just bringing children in. They don't have a choice because they need that extra $2 to survive. Every parent there that I ever spoke to understands the importance that their children should get an education. But it's a matter of basic survival. So pay them enough to keep the children in school, and that solves a lot of the child labor problems. It also enhances future development for the entire community. Why not build a few schools? Do you know how expensive it is to build a few schools? It's not much. It's a concrete structure with some chairs, and you buy some books and a teacher. Build some schools while you're at it. How about expand sanitation so we can reduce waterborne illness? And so there's so many things you could do to support and help those communities that don't cost that much and would make a huge difference in their basic livelihood. If they're getting a basic dignified day wage of $10 or $12, there's not this push to dig those tunnels to try to get the higher grade that's going to give them $4. And then all the associated suffering that comes with that is eliminated. That doesn't solve the problems. There's still other issues relating to the environmental impact and making sure mining companies operate sustainably. There's local corruption that would have to be dealt with. Sexual violence would have to be dealt with. There's a lot of other things, but there's some immediate low-hanging fruit that could be deployed very quickly to eliminate a substantial amount of the day-to-day harm that people are suffering.
It seems like a relatively simple proposition compared to the problems that Silicon Valley geniuses have solved that end up using these minerals. Like, you look at a smartphone and how amazing this device is. It seems far more complex than solving for basic human dignity at the bottom of the supply chain.
I couldn't agree more. Actually, figuring out how to manufacture that smartphone or an electric car and erect the supply chains and all of that efficiently, that is way more complicated than figuring out how to maintain basic dignity for people in the Congo. That's a simple problem. It's a simple problem. So the question, Jordan, is why haven't they done it? And that comes back to this uncomfortable truth that the perception is they're not worth it. They're not worth the effort. They're not worth the attention. They're not worth the modest amounts of money required to transform and improve conditions at the bottom of these supply chains. And that's been the curse of being African for generations, for centuries, that they're somehow perceived to be worth less. Oh, yeah, they don't mind taking their kids to work because parents don't care over there. I mean, this is the nonsense that, you hear at the top of the chain. No, they love their children as much as we love ours. They want a better life for their children just like we do. But treating them as if they're somehow worth less, feel less, care less, and that their environment can be sacrificed in order for us to preserve ours with this green transition to EVs, all of that is predicated on the assumption that they aren't worth the same as us.
How does this then result in, and I know this is going to be sort of a large question here, but how does this result in what you term deglobalization? And what does that actually mean?
Well, it's going to mean something different for everyone. Remember that there
Waves.
are two aspects, two things you need for globalization to work. Number one, you need the physical interconnectivity, the transport systems that are low cost and very, very safe. The lower the cost of transport per unit, the more steps you can get in your supply chain, the greater capacity there is to expand into things that otherwise would be so low cost that you wouldn't trade them internationally. Things like wheat, for example, or plastics. Second, you need a balance of production and consumption, and that in many ways is a subset of demographic structures. So you need to have a significant number of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s in order to generate the capital and the skilled labor base to produce, but then you also need a lot of people in their 20s and 30s to do some of the lower skilled stuff as well as consume. And this all has to be in balance for it to work. The demographic aging we've seen in recent decades means that that second piece is just completely gone. And countries are increasingly find it in their best interest to kind of hoard what consumption they do have and not allow trade access to it, and then producing more locally. We were moving this way before the Ukraine war, before the Chinese started to break down, and before the German industrial model started to implode. This has just sped everything up. As for the first end with transport, we're kind of we're kind of in this hanging moment where we're waiting for someone to take the first shot now that the
Hmm.
Americans lack the capacity to protect the system. But even if we don't get a formal conflict over transport, by everyone kind of hoarding the production and consumption zones for themselves, we no longer have a vested interest anywhere in the world in what happens over the horizon. And as long as that is the case, we can get regional transport breakdowns that, from our point of view, don't affect us. But from everyone else's point of view, it's a bit of a disaster. And the more linked in your country is to these networks, the more vulnerable you are. So, China, Korea, Germany, very much so at the very top of that list for different reasons, but they're all dependent upon the inflow and outflow. And so, you can damage global transport significantly before the Americans really notice. Not only is the United States one of the world's biggest mining countries for raw materials, so is Canada, so is Mexico. Brazil isn't that far away, and it's all in the same hemisphere. So you can have an Eastern hemispheric breakdown, which today, three-quarters of population, three-quarters of energy, three-quarters of food production, three-quarters of manufactured goods. And for the most part, the Western hemisphere actually does better.
Hmm. Okay. So, can you give us an example of what this means in a specific sector like smartphones, right? If we just don't have the ability to manufacture components in all these different places and move them into one place to then get manufactured and then ship those out to be sold, what is that? What happens, right? Because I can't even imagine this world where that system doesn't exist anymore.
Sure. Well, the smartphone industry is probably simultaneously the most sophisticated and spread out in terms of globalization and manufacturing, and the most vulnerable.
That's why I picked it.
Yeah, fair enough. So the iPhone has 1,400 supply chain steps that touch 50 different countries. So you'll get the plastics probably from a precursor material that comes from the United States. You'll get the copper probably from Chile, but it's probably processed in China. It's probably built into an integrated circuit in Taiwan, with the design happening in California. And the system on a chip that kind of ties it all together is probably from Japan, but it is made out of components from throughout Southeast Asia, and so on and so on and so on. You miss one of these, you don't have a phone. And what Apple has discovered under Tim Cook, Tim Cook was brought in to operationalize the supply chain to make it the most efficient it could be. And in doing so, 90% of those supply chain steps now in some way touch China. And what we've discovered with these COVID lockdowns of the last 2 weeks is that the facilities are no longer functioning. So Apple has stopped. I have a phone that I ordered 2 months ago that was supposed to be delivered 2 weeks ago, and now I've received a notice that it's probably not even been built yet.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that they were that far behind. I figured
They do have a facility in China with 100,000 people. And so, when that goes offline, do the math.
Yeah.
Now, this is not the death of Apple.
Mm-hmm.
They've got billions in the bank. They can rebuild their supply chain in other places.
You already paid for the phone. They're fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's a 5-year process. So this iPhone that I'm trying to get is probably the last one for a while, until they completely rebuild their supply chain so it's China free. Because China is no longer a reliable manufacturing partner.
Oh, wow.
And they're going to have to do that in places they don't have operations. You don't do that overnight. You don't do that cheaply. And Apple will be doing this at the same time other sectors are trying to do the relocation at the same time.
Sure.
So because of demographic reasons, we have an absolute cap on how much labor we have available in the United States. Same with Canada. Mexico is in a better position, but there's still an upper limit. So everyone who's trying to nearshore or reshore or friendshore at the same time has to compete for an absolute upper limit of labor availability. And we're now seeing that happen across the entire manufacturing world.
Oof, that seems. I mean, the gravity of this is extreme, because when we start looking at, okay, we have to move all this. Oh, and so does every other company. So now they need to find people that were in places where they can build factories, get the property, get the licenses, have the local fixers do whatever they need to do, except now 500 or 5,000 companies need to do the same thing with the same staff in the same place. The prices are going to go up. The amount of people that can help them do this is going to just be, it's finite. First of all, they just can't work on 8,700 projects at once. It's not possible. And all of that kind of has to happen at the same time, or at least they're in a race to do that, because otherwise they can't really make money.
Yeah, the smart firms started this process in the last year of the Obama administration. Now, maybe for wildly different reasons. And then it accelerated under Trump because he launched a trade war, and then accelerated more under COVID, and now it's accelerated under Biden because Biden's even more economically nationalist. And now we've hit the wall.
Something that has been discussed a lot lately in the media, that 80% of the Chinese-made cotton products are sourced in the Uyghur homeland. More than 20% of the cotton products produced or sold around the world are sourced in Xinjiang. So that gives you a perspective. Today, people in Shanghai use natural gas from Xinjiang. And also, people in inland Chinese cities and parts of the United States use agricultural products. Heinz ketchup, for example, uses Xinjiang tomato. Coca-Cola also use forced labor to make Coca-Cola. There's
Really?
Yes, 83 brands: Nike, Coca-Cola, Adidas, Puma, H&M. H&M tried to do the right thing, but they got punished. Intel and the battery, all the sneakers that we buy. That's why the United States government passed this legislation called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to address that issue. So the natural resources made the Uyghur homeland even more important strategically to the Chinese. So the crude oil reserve is as much as that of Kuwait. When I use that comparison, people can appreciate we tried to save Kuwait from Saddam Hussein for energy reason for the most part. So the energy, natural resources that goes from all the minerals, rare earth, agricultural products, and now the technological products, the and any equipments related to green technology. Elon Musk has a shop in Urumqi, the dealership. So it is strategically, politically, economically a significant area, and used to be to the Chinese, but to the world now.
So it's quite shameful that the United States is one of the biggest markets, or even the biggest market for Uyghur slave labor-made goods, shoes, solar panels, cotton. I didn't know about the tomatoes in ketchup being a Xinjiang product. I mean, it's horrible. Look, it's just so disgusting, right? Slave labor is, of course, cheaper than paying workers, so you can
Campbell soup too.
What's that?
Campbell soup. Campbell soup too.
Oh, for the tomato soup? Jeez, man. It's so horrible that it's such a big problem that you can't really get around it. I mean, what are you going to do? Boycott ketchup? Even if you do that, there's still slaves making the solar panels that are on the roof of my house right now. I'm wearing a shirt that's synthetic. Great. Okay, maybe so it wasn't made by slaves, but my underwear is made out of cotton. You know, it's like you can't help but support this, indirectly support this kind of thing. And of course, since slave labor is so inexpensive, it allows Chinese companies to undercut prices and then dump the products on the market and drive American solar panels, for example, out of business. It's not that the Chinese panels are made cheaper because of the materials. They're made cheaper because the people making them are literally enslaved in many cases, which is horrifying. And I looked at this when I read your book. I was thinking, how is it that supply chains are so opaque? How do we not know? Isn't there some investigation that a company like H&M or Nike or Campbell's is going to do where they send somebody and say, where do we grow the tomatoes? Then where do they go? Then where do they go? Then where do they go? Well, apparently the Chinese Communist Party will not allow auditing of supply chains unless you use their firms to audit the supply chain. And of course, you just have to take their frickin' word for it that no slave labor is used and that they're not dumping chemicals or whatever in there. It's such a sort of complete information control by the Chinese Communist Party. Have you heard about this? Somebody had bought a product. I can't remember what it was. And a help note fell out of the product. It was a toy or a hair product, and somebody found a note written by someone. It said, "Help! We're slaves. We're making these products. They've got us locked up." Have you heard about this?
No, I missed that one. But there's something else is also important. I'm sorry for keep mentioning my book, but I give my book a title, No Escape, for both personal and broader audience reason, because I have not been free, even though I am an American citizen, senior U.S. government official. I don't feel that I'm free. Have not been able to escape this repression. And on the other hand, for the reasons that you're eloquently describing, this is America's problem now. So American people can no longer say, I have nothing to do with it. The guy who owns the San Francisco Warrior, Shamas, said that who cares about the Uyghurs? He can say that expresses the sentiment in Silicon Valley. But American people are better than that. They're not going to be able to say, oh, it's okay for me to wrap my baby around with the baby pajamas that I buy from Costco, knowing that it was produced by a fellow human being. And the African-American community cannot say, oh, yeah, we dealt with the cotton trade, but it's okay to use the wig made by Uyghur prisoner woman. You know, there is a story that you may have seen in the book. 13 tons of human hair was seized by the CBP that was allegedly or reportedly were made by Uyghur women, prisoners' shaved hair. And they were targeting African-American community. And if people in an environmental activist group say, oh, we need to conserve the planet, and guess what? The notion that you're putting out, I am with you. The earth is in peril, so is the Uyghurs. But if you say that, at the same time, you can also say no to the Chinese on the genocide. We can fight genocide and ecocide at the same time. You cannot just ignore the solar panels because it's cheap. And the Chinese makes the solar panel using slave labor and dirty coal. And we cannot compete with a assembly line uses dirty coal and slave labor. We don't do that. So it's on us. We can no longer feel indifferent about this atrocity. This is not a typical human rights atrocity. 2 years ago, in 2019, I believe 2019, 2020, CSIS published a report, a fact sheet on the forced labor.
Is this the Canadian Intelligence Service?
No, the Center for International Strategic Studies here in Washington, D.C. They have a human rights initiative. They have this two-line that really caught my attention. One, while the United States and our partners have been having this conversation about how to stop the slavery, modern-day slavery, the export volume to Italy doubled during the same period, while the Congress is making lots of public statements and sanctions being announced. United States remain to be the largest export destination for Xinjiang products. That gives you a sense what we're dealing with. That gives you a sense. And how do we get there? As in addition to what you pointed out, the auditing difficulty. Chinese have been very effective using the business community against our government to keep it quiet. At the same time, they made us, American consumers, addicted to cheap products. So as long as we continue to buy cheap products imported from China at Target, Walmart, Costco, we're okay with it. So there's a societal problem, there's a political problem, there's unethical business operations problem brought us this mess.
I want to go back for a second. You said 13 tons of hair were seized in a shipment from China. And Customs and Border Patrol this is them who reported this. Whenever you're trying to find something that's illicit, getting one shipment is one shipment. You're probably talking about less than 1% of the shipments. If you're looking for drugs or something like that, you're just not catching even remotely half of what's being imported. So for those of us that have not yet connected the dots here, we're talking about 13 tons of human hair. How many imprisoned women's heads do you need to forcibly shave to get 13 tons of human hair? Well, we did the math. It's approximately 250,000 people, and we know this. We know how to do that math because of hair taken from Jews at Auschwitz and other concentration camps during World War II. And this, like you said, was geared to be sold towards African Americans, who were, of course, shocked because of their own history and humiliation with slavery. So they're the primary consumers of black human hair products, as you might expect. So it's just very horrifying to think that somebody's in prison, they get their hair shaved off as part of their humiliation, and then it gets turned around and sold as a fashion product in the United States, and we are just buying it as fast as they will sell it. By the way, I looked up the help note thing that I just mentioned. It was in St. Petersburg in Russia, a pair of North Face shoes. Somebody brought them home, and then inside there was a note sewn that said, "Help, I am in jail in China, please help, Uyghur." And it was sewn into the shoe. So,
wow.
Made by a slave in prison, wrote a note, sewed it right into the shoe, ended up in Russia.
It's amazing. The reason that we don't have specific information as to who has been transferred into the forced labor camps is because of this tight control. No access by journalists. The most recent access by UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet, who's happened to be Xi Jinping's close friend, came back with a lot of complimentary words about Xi Jinping and this genocide. There's no word on this enslavement of the Uyghurs or slave labor, that China managed to pollute global supply chain. And the global community, consumer community, has been continued to feed that genocide and enslavement of fellow human beings.
What made you want to go undercover in, was it Mali in Africa, to investigate child trafficking? Because that just, we're trying to write about something, expose something, do a podcast about something, that I get, but you were just like, no, I want to go and see this with my own eyes. That had to be kind of a trick, no pun intended.
Yeah, I think I didn't think too much about it then. I was
That's the
just
key,
so
right?
focused. Yeah, because if you think too much, you probably don't do stupid things and go undercover in Mali with lots of jihadists and lots of trouble. It's a very, very poor country. But I decided to go undercover because, sneaking around like a white guy in remote areas in Mali is not like too easy, and with an open camera. So, but on the other hand, it was just a daily thing that kids from Mali were transported from Mali into Ivory Coast and then into the cocoa plantations. So, I was just sitting at a bus stop in the southern part of the country, and some local helpers told me, hey, you just wait for the next bus and you will see that kids, 6, 8, 10 years old, are getting picked up by traffickers. And they literally just did that in front of my face. And wow. I remember this. So it was so like heartbreaking because, you're out on a mission. You want to have your documentation of the problems. On the other hand, I just wanted to stop it in a way, to just go run to the local police and say, hey, guys, there is illegal activities, but it's not an option when you're out working undercover in countries like Mali.
Of course. I mean, if there are kids, first of all, 6, 8, and 10, up to age, I think 14 was one of the kids in the documentary, or 15 years old, something like that. I mean, I have a 3-year-old kid, and I had to build a Lego set with him last night. And it's tough for him to do that. He's 3. I can't really imagine what a 6-year-old could do on a plantation. And also, I assume you're not really getting your money's worth out of a 6-year-old kid. So they work there for years, I would imagine, until you do. And it's just the heart. It's so unbelievably cruel to think of a 6-year-old kid who should be watching cartoons and eating cereal in his pajamas, getting up early after sleeping outside in a hut that's locked and cutting cocoa pods open for 8 to 12 hours a day in the sun, and being smuggled in there away from his mom and dad, away from his brothers and sisters, from Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. It's really heartbreaking, and that's understating this, of course. But yeah, you can't report it to the cops because they already know. They know, of course they know.
Yeah, it's so easy information to get. And that was what I was also a bit shocking for me, that let's just say it was hiding the problems. No, it's easy. And the companies, the executives, they know. Cargill has been present in Cote d'Ivoire for more than 40 years. They have like thousands of employees in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ivory Coast. It takes you a couple of hours driving into the cocoa belt in your 4-wheel driver, and then you will walk into random. They even know where the cocoa comes from the specific areas and plantations, because they have to know the producers of the cocoa. So it's so easy. It's just under your nose. So claiming, at that time when I did my first film, they said, "Oh my goodness, we didn't know there was a problem." Well, today they are more like, well, we know there is a problem and we are doing our best to stop this, which is bollocks in my opinions. Because if you wanted to stop this, it would be so easy. Look at them right now. People can't pay their bills for energy. In Europe, it's a big disaster at the moment. And you know what? Governments around Europe, they are now forcing people to say, hey, we need to be in houses. We need to pull down the heat because we are lacking electricity and energy. And guess what? They have a solution to it. It's all about being able to make decisions, to make changes. They can make the changes. And that's what's really, sorry for my French, pisses me off.
Yeah.
That we are talking about America's biggest company, family-owned consumer company, supermarket, Cargill. They could change this, and they would be front runners if they did that. But unfortunately, they don't really care. I have to say, this is, of course, my opinion. They don't care, because if they did care, they would make the changes. They can do it hand in hand with Mars, with Nestle, with all the big companies. That would be so easy to do.
Yeah, it really is horrifying, and I think what you're doing is important because I'm sure their logic goes a little something like this: we can't stop child slavery because it will raise. That means we would have to pay workers more, and if we pay workers more, or we pay even the child laborers actual money to deal with this problem, where we enforce this, it's going to raise the price of chocolate. And if Cargill raises the price of chocolate, then Mars or Nestle, and they don't do that, we're going to lose to our competitors. So what you're doing is surfacing this such that the publicity is so bad for everyone involved that they all have to do it at the same time, which means at the end consumer pays 5 cents or 4 cents more for a bar of chocolate, and no kids die on no kids are trafficked from poor countries to other countries to work in fields all day as slaves. And that's that's the definition of fair trade, really,
It
in
is.
many ways.
And at the moment, the thing is, when you look at the production of a chocolate bar, only 6 to 7% of the money goes to the farmers. So, there is, let's just put it this way, there is space to make it a better deal for the farmers. Why is it the one who does all the hard work will get the lowest pay? Of course, I know, because they don't have a union. They don't have
power.
the
Yeah.
power to make this. And unfortunately, too many hands have to get money before it goes to the consumers. But as you said, the consumers could also, do something to change things by, for instance, not buying that kind of chocolate.
Yeah, we'll talk about that towards the end of the show because I do have some questions about what we can do. The other thing is, and I know that there's people who go, yeah, well, it's market power, economic. Nobody needs chocolate. It's a luxury product, right? I can't not get to work because my car doesn't have chocolate in it. I'm not going to freeze over the cold winter because I don't have chocolate, right? It's a luxury good. So you can't really apply the same sort of rationalizations and justifications as you would to natural gas, gasoline, petroleum, whatever. And we've done, like you mentioned, we figured out how to deal with the fact that we don't have the petroleum issue, and yet we're willing to go, kids, slaves, farming cocoa pods. Look, we got bigger fish to fry, and that's the sad truth about this. And it really is like an epidemic of vanishing children. You spotlight this single village that you walked into, and I think this was, there were something like 500 inhabitants in this village. It's very small.
430.
Yeah. Yeah, not even 500. And it's missing 130 plus children. So over 20% of the population of this village is missing, or a quarter of the population is missing. And they don't know where the kids are. They were saying the traffickers come to these village markets and they lure the kids away without even telling the parents, which, as a parent of a small kid, I cannot even imagine the trauma, the nightmare that this induces. You take the kids to the market to go get some frickin' tomatoes and they just never come home. And then maybe they escape 5 years later after being enslaved. I mean, it's just a terrible, horrific situation.
It is. And what I really don't understand is why we, in such a rich world we are living in, 2022 now, and this is still a problem. Modern slavery with kids. That's really what pisses me off, that we are talking about our future, our children. One thing is that you have modern slavery with adults around the world, but with children, how dare we to not acting right away to stop this right? Why is it that big countries like US and all the countries in the EU and Europe does not stop this immediately? Because we don't care.
We don't care.
That's the only conclusion I can reach to, is we don't care. Why is it that we don't care about children? They don't have a voice. They don't have any power. They don't have anything, and they are going to be the future of this world. I find that horrible. It's horrible terrible.
I completely agree. I was horrified to find out how many kids were working on these cocoa plantations. It's something, and there are different estimates out there. You'll look at one that says 1.5 million, which in Ivory Coast and Ghana mostly, and other organizations will say 30,000. But even if you take that ridiculously low estimate, that is a ton of child slaves, no matter how you look at it. The population of the city I grew up in was like 40,000, right? So the idea that 3/4 of that could have been enslaved children, that's hard. That's hard to swallow. I think you wrote this in one of the pieces, or this was written about you. The world's chocolate companies depend on cocoa produced with the aid of more than 1 million West African child laborers, according to a new report sponsored by the Labor Department.
That's
Nearly
right.
nearly 1.6 million children were engaged in child labor in cocoa production, according to the survey, and most of those were involved in tasks considered hazardous, such as wielding machetes, carrying heavy loads, or working with pesticides. Because of changes in methodology, the number of child laborers in the new survey, blah, 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 the reason the numbers don't match, basically. And this isn't about you, sorry. It was an article written that also had your mention of you in it and your work in it. So it's just crazy numbers. And the U.S. Department of Labor in 2015 said it's probably more like 2 million children. And these are not organizations known for hyperbolic misinformation, right? It's the Department of Labor.
Exactly.
They're just crunching the numbers here.
Exactly. And that's what I don't understand. Well, even the companies right now are agreeing to that kind of numbers. It's not like something they disagree in. We know there is a problem. And that's why I said I started my first research back in 2008 and up to now they admit, well, we have a problem. And now they're just saying, now it's 2025, everything would be, good again. Everything would be sustainable, produced, and there would be no kids out there. That's a new fat big lie. Because why is it, first of all, why is it that they have to have more time? They've been working on this officially from 2001, where they said we will get rid of all child labor in the so-called Harkin-Engel protocol made by two representatives, one of from the House and one of the Senate, and nothing has happened since. They've just pushed the date of when this will not be a problem anymore. And I have no faith in that any politician really can make any changes, because they have had so many options to get rid of this problem. And I'm genuinely asking myself, why is it? Why isn't a company like Cargill or Mars saying, well, we could do a PR stunt, a PR marketing out of this. Now we want to be the first mover. We are living in a world right now where the planet is under pressure. The climate changes is doing a good job trying to get rid of all of us. We have lots of problems with animal welfare and stuff. I'm just thinking, why is it that some of them in the boardroom saying, guys, I think I have a brilliant idea. Let's just invite this guy, Mickey from Denmark, and ask him, can we do this together with you and a few others, and tell us how we can do it, and we will pay what it costs. They would be a big business for them. And I do not understand why they don't do that, because right now it's the time for big changes, and the consumers will follow this suggestion. I'm 100%. But I know what is the problem. You mentioned it in the beginning. The problem is that no one dare to take the lead alone.
Right.
They have to agree in a big group of all the big companies that this is what we do. Instead of being front runners and make the changes this world so in need of. I genuinely don't understand. But
Yeah, it's I mean, Europe tends to lead the way on this. We do that kind of thing with laws and regulation. And I'm not a huge fan of over regulating things, but this is one of those areas where laws and regulation come in and make everybody change at the same time, and that's the only way we rip off this Band-Aid. Going back to something you'd said earlier with Hark and Engel, so people know what that is with the senator and the House of Representatives. They were trying back in, was it 2001 or so, trying to get just a label on chocolate that said, hey, this bar may be made with child labor. It was something along those lines. Or this bar was not made with child labor, and they had to audit the thing. So they set the deadline. Of course, industry fought that like crazy. They missed the 2005 deadline. They missed the 2010 deadline. Then the industry said, well, let's just revise our goal and make it less ambitious. Let's just get a 70% reduction in child labor instead of eliminating it. And then we'll do that by 2020. And then that goal, too, surprise, surprise, didn't get met. And there's also still no plan to label chocolate that's made with slave labor. So basically, they delayed, didn't do anything, then reduced the goal, then didn't even accomplish that. And now they're just basically ignoring it.
yeah, and I think since they started this, they had a joint agreement of having a kind of program which covers all the companies. But right now, they have taken all the programs back. So Nestle has their own, Mondelez has, for instance, Cocoa Life. So they have their own programs to try to fight against child labor, but nothing really works. I was in Ghana that was in January this year. That's Mondelez. Mondelez owns Cadbury, which is a former big British brand, a chocolate brand. Mondelez is American, based in Chicago. It's a huge chocolate manufacturer. And you know what? I went to the Cocoa Life plantations, the so-called sustainable sourced cocoa plantations.
Mm-hmm.
It was full of Ghanaian children working, even forced one. We met she was 12, and she was so afraid. She was against her will at that plantation, but she didn't dare to say anything to the plantation owner.
Of course. And she's a 12-year-old girl who's alone. Why would she say anything? Why would she? Yeah.
Her wish was to go to school.
Yeah, that's another important note. These kids are not in school. It's not like they go to school and they work an hour in the cocoa plantation. They sleep outside in these huts in the fields. Then in the morning, somebody who's essentially their jailer will unlock the door and let them out for, I don't know, 6-8 hours of work, whatever the work day is.
From
12?
More 12 hours, yes. From
and
6 morning to 6 in the afternoon, yeah.
Yeah, in the African sun during the harvest season. It's horrible. I mean, there's no getting around it. There's just no getting around it.